By now, you should have gathered enough materials that you're starting to see how things are going to come together. But if it still feels overwhelming and confusing, don't panic. Just keep plugging away at it, gathering your materials, and answering that research question. Writing an academic research paper is one of those things where you have to remember to try to see both the forest and the trees at the same time, right? So in other words, you need to zoom in and pay attention to the little details that you're finding in your sources, but you also sometimes have to take a step back and be able to kind of see the whole thing at once and get a sense of where you're at and what you still need to gather. Like so many other parts of this assignment, starting to put together your thesis, or the answer to your research question, is not going to be a straightforward process. It's going to be iterative, like everything else that we're doing. So you're going to create a draft of that argument, that thesis, that you'll come back to as you keep going, because you're going to keep finding sources, you're going to keep trying to incorporate them, and as you do that, it might be necessary to go back and tweak your thesis, shift it, move it around, etc. But just like with the research question, it's really important to develop a draft thesis at pretty soon in the process, right? So if you're not quite ready, that's okay, but this week we should start thinking about how you're going to put together what you're finding into an academic argument. And there are two parts to that. One is the thesis statement, which is a single sentence, which will come right near the end of your introduction, and in which you state your entire argument and why it matters, right? So you're making a claim about what you have found in your research that answers your research question in the form of an argument. And the other part of that argument is then the body of your research paper, right? So the thesis is just one sentence, but each body paragraph of your paper will connect to and support the validity of that thesis statement. When you're thinking about the argument, a really important question that you need to answer about everything that you found is, so what? Right? And I know it sounds kind of flippant to say it like that, but really that's what your argument should be doing, is telling us, so what? Why is this important? Why is this something that we should all care about? To varying degrees, right? We don't have to be passionate about it, but why should we care about the argument that you're putting forward? In the next part of the video, I'm going to walk you through what thesis statements do, what they are, how to create one, how to make sure that yours is working properly, and how to use it to make sure that your paper is doing what it's supposed to do. But first, a couple of things that thesis statements definitely are not. Thesis statements are not questions. They are not simple statements of fact. They should not be an oversimplification of a complex issue, and they are not simply stating your topic. A thesis statement presents an argument with which a reasonable person could disagree. It is your informed opinion about your topic based on what you have found through your research, right? So that one statement, the thesis statement, summarizes all of that and puts it in one place, usually right at the end of the introduction, so that your reader knows what this paper is all about and what's going to come next. The other piece of that argument is the body paragraphs that then support and develop the ideas and present evidence, analysis, background, and method that support the validity of the argument that you have arrived at after doing all of this work. So your thesis statement should do a number of different things. It should be a single, well-constructed sentence that is logical, that answers all the parts of your research question as specifically as possible. It should clearly state the main idea and purpose of your paper, establishes your argument from the very beginning, indicates the significance of your argument, and is the last sentence of your introduction. There are three main things that you want to keep in mind as you're drafting your thesis statement. The first is, of course, your research question, because your thesis is essentially the answer to that question. The second is your own ideas on the topic, right? I encourage you to bring yourself to your paper. What do you think? And how has what you think been shaped by what you've learned from your research? So as you sit down to draft your thesis statement, think about a couple of different things, right? Don't try to write it perfectly the first time. Let it be a rough draft. Just get it down on paper. Make sure it has all the parts, and then go back to it as you write and revise as the sentence as you need to. when you're drafting your outline, make sure that all the paragraphs relate back to and support that main argument. And as you continue to develop your paper, you may find that you need to go back and revise the thesis statement again, even by the time you're all the way finished with your paper. By the time you get to writing your conclusion, your ideas will have clarified because you've just spent pages and pages writing about them. So sometimes when you summarize that argument in the conclusion, it ends up being a stronger version of your thesis statement. So don't be shy about that, right? Just move it right up to the beginning of the introduction and put your best foot forward. You always want to make sure that it's unified, right? It should have one singular focus. If you look at it and there are two statements loosely connected by a coordinate conjunction, something like and, but, or, try to see if you can rephrase it to make the relationship between the parts of the sentence more clear. Because if they're there, they're probably there for a reason, but it's important to have the connection between the parts of that sentence be more clear than just this and this. So think about how they're related to each other. If they are, great. If not, you might need to narrow things down and choose a singular focus. You want to make sure that your thesis is narrow and specific. You want to think about what you can accomplish in the number of pages of this assignment, right? So, you want to avoid skimming the surface of a topic that's too big to write about intelligently in 10 pages. Can you discuss the entire Civil War in 3 pages? Probably. Will it be worth reading? Maybe not. You'd have to hit on things at a level that is not what you want in this kind of paper. You really want to be able to go in depth and answer all of those parts of your research question. Who, what, when, where, why, how. You want to make sure that your thesis statement is clear, specific, and logical. So you want to avoid vague, abstract language. Something like, it's good is not really helpful, right? Because it's too vague. It's not specific enough. You want to avoid jargon. So if there are specific terms in the field that your research is focused on, that's okay, but don't put them in your argument. Save them for later. If they're important, you can explain them to your audience, but they don't need to be in the statement itself. And if you do use terms that vary in meaning, such as socialism, democracy, things like that, try not to use them in your thesis statement, but if you do need to use them and they're absolutely necessary to your argument, then make sure that you take the time to define how you are using them in the context of your argument so your reader is very clear about what it is that you're saying. And then you always want to check and double check that cause and effect relationship that you set up, right? Thinking about that unification of the thesis statement and how the different parts are related to one another, the logic of the argument. Does one thing follow the next? Does it make sense? And speaking of, you also want to make sure that your thesis statement is actually an argument, right? You're not going to simply announce your topic. Your thesis should be something with which a reasonable person could disagree. So that means that, it's based on your evidence, it's based on your analysis, but somebody might have a different opinion, in theory, also based on research. So you want to make sure that your thesis is arguable. You want to avoid making universal pro-con statements that oversimplify complex issues. Definitely avoid absolute statements, right? It makes it sound like things are stronger, like all Americans love football, but really all it takes is one person to raise their hand and be like, I don't love football, for that to be proven wrong, essentially. And you want to justify the argument, right? Answer that so what question. Why should people care about this? This one can be intimidating, right? You want to make sure that your thesis is original and interesting. And it may start to feel, as you're doing this research, that there's already so much stuff out there, but try to approach it in a way that only you can. Use active rather than passive voice. Use your own words. Don't include quotations or evidence in your thesis statement or in your introduction for that matter. Save those for later. Those are part of the body paragraphs. And count on your research. What have you found? How does it fit together, right? You're not just researching one thing and then telling us what you found. You're looking at all the different parts of your issue. So how do they come together? How do they answer that question? In brief, here's a quick checklist. Is your thesis statement clear? It should not be a question. Does it make a single, focused, and arguable claim? Are the words in the thesis unambiguous and specific? And does it avoid being generic, obvious, or directly answerable? Is it original and interesting? So now I have a little exercise for you, and you can do it when pause the video or not. That's up to you. But thinking about how the thesis statement can help you figure out what body paragraphs you need to include, right? And this is important when you get to drafting your outline, but also developing the paper. So we're going to look at this sample thesis statement. Because modern cinematic techniques have allowed filmmakers to show more graphic depictions of violence, horror flicks have desensitized young American viewers. We're not going to critique the thesis statement so much as use it to think about what the paper that this thesis statement belongs to might include. And before you pause, I have one more slide that might help you think about this, right? So this is sort of the idea of thinking like, what does your reader need to know in order to understand the validity of your argument? And the BEAM method can really help you think about this here. Like, what background information do they need? What kinds of evidence do you have to present? How have other people interpreted this information? And is there a particular approach that readers need to understand? So go ahead and pause if you want to experiment with this and just make a list of all of the potential body paragraphs that you would expect to see in an essay for which this was the thesis. Okay, ready? So here's my list. You might expect to find any of these in a paper with this thesis statement. So different kinds of techniques in filmmaking might be a whole body paragraph. Why this is bad, how this is bad, that might be another body paragraph. Which filmmakers are we talking about here, right? What is a more specific definition of horror? So the thesis itself can sort of lead us to what all of those body paragraphs are going to be and what they're going to look like. So that's one way to use it as you're developing the outline for your paper and as you're thinking about those two parts of the argument. The thesis, which is this compressed, condensed, one-sentence thing at the beginning of the paper, and then the entire rest of your paper. So each of those body paragraphs that are really going to present evidence, give us some background information, make it so that by the time we get to the end of your paper, the validity of that thesis statement is just super clear.